Hello, this is Paul Chek. Welcome to part 2 of my little video lesson exploring pornography. The title again is Exploring Pornography, part 2 of 2. In the first part, for those of you that watched it, I explained what the definition of pornography was. I talked about our biological evolution and the concept of monogamous relationships or pair bonding in nature, showed that there was some misinterpretations, or shall we say scientific validations that had individual biases printed into them. And I suggested that pornography relates to orgiastic practices, in other words, watching other people have sex or having sex with multiple people or different people, all the things that would fall into the class of pornography or orgiastic practices. I shared that it's really up to each individual to decide how that fits with their wants, needs, and desires, and suggested that you look carefully at what your dream is for your life at any given time, and just simply ask yourself the question, is pornographic exposure, experience, practices facilitating connection and the growth and development of wholeness within you, or is it detracting from your ability to accomplish your own stated dream, goal, or objective, and that anybody with adult intelligence should be able to make those decisions for themselves? And therein lies the problem. It assumes that people that have the bodies of adults have the mind and the intelligence of adults, which is, as I will show you today, largely the basis of almost all the problems that we have with everything from sex to food to money to drugs to politics, you name it. Today I'm going to take you on an interesting tour of the history of religious faiths over time and their influence on man as they relate to pornographic information or orgiastic behavior. Once I take you through this map of religious faiths, I will then read you a list of findings based on scientific exploration, archaeological evidence, and historical compilations by experts in various fields. And I will highlight the specific sexual practices used in each of these eras, cultures, and periods of time, so that you can get a look at how does these concepts of pornography fit into the growth and development of the human psyche over time, how do they fit into cultural behaviors over time, and why are we having such a hard time with them now? When, as I'll show you, they're very much a part of who human beings are, and the fact that we are denying that leads to repression and all the interesting twists and diseases and psychological disorders and abuse of drugs and conundrums that come from repressing what is natural, which also leads to the fact that we're often parented by people that hold the kind of biases and low levels of development that I will get into. Once I finish that, I'm going to then take this to a different level. I'm going to show you the now scientifically validated and recognized stages of consciousness as it develops through any religion or spiritual practice or life process itself. And we will look at how each of these various stages of development of the mind play out in a large populace like the world, where we have people at all stages of growth and development, which is exactly what you see as a child grows and develops. So you can actually correlate these stages of growth and development of the mind and consciousness with that of the normal growth and development or ideal growth and development of any child into adulthood and maturity. My goal is, by the end, to have left you with enough material to A, go look at the resources and make up your own mind if you don't like what I'm saying, B, to have an awareness of where your judgments lie so that you can identify yourself honestly in the stages of conscious development or mental development, which would also be mental emotional development, and maybe reflect on your own judgments and ask yourself, does this really serve me, and does this really represent who I am, or am I acting out the beliefs of other people and religions and parents and people like that that actually don't serve me, and am I doing things in the background, in the closet, and living one way away from the eyes and ears of other people, but wearing another mask or face out in the public to maintain what is called herd mentality, to fit in often to a group that you really don't find yourself aligned with internally, which leads to a split in a person's personality, which is also linked with all sorts of health problems and psychological challenges, which lead to, again, the abuse of drugs, be they medical or recreational. And also these things that I'm going to talk about are some of the most common causes of serious challenges in relationships, particularly when your relationships are built on the very ideas that are now causing us to turn against pornography, normal sexual behavior, and our own instinctual way of relating to each other, which is quite sad and challenging. So let's begin. First, I recommended last time that you look at the book Sex at Dawn. I also said there was a book that antagonizes this one, Sex at Dusk, so you could have a chance to make up your own mind. What I'm sharing with you in all my blogs is based on my life experience, my work as a holistic health practitioner, which is now 32 years, during which I've done extensive study and research into all things that are necessary to help people heal, including studying all world religions, various spiritual practices, being a practicing, licensed Native American medicine man spirit guide, also known as a shaman, and having devoted my life to helping people, most of which were what are called medical failures, identify what it was that was actually stopping them from healing, regardless of what diseases they had, drugs they had, surgeries they had, or therapeutic approaches. And the amount of times that I end up having to work with people who have cancer and various diseases that are not healing, that I find these very beliefs, biases, and judgments and pains hiding behind broken relationships with parents, family members, and loved ones is shockingly high, which is why in the Chek teachings I have implemented training on the understanding of what God is, and use what you will see as an integrated approach to how to address these issues, because as holistic lifestyle coaches, it is extremely dangerous to carry in the kind of biases that we see in society leading to the disease into a coaching practice, because you will never be able to coach someone with the same disease that you carry. You're both blind and you're both lost, and unfortunately a lot of people are paying coaches and therapists and doctors to help them overcome things that the doctors, coaches, and therapists themselves are still, shall we say, suffering from to a great degree. And whatever we don't want to address within ourselves, we repress, and it becomes part of our shadow, and we become blind to it, and sadly we often attack it as a means of tending to try to get people to look away from what we're hiding. Classic behavior amongst human beings, and very linked to shadow behaviors. So to begin with then, I'm going to draw from some very, very scholarly works. These are rare books. They're very expensive. Rivers of Life or Faiths of Man by J.G.R. Forlong. These are very, very expensive. I don't know if you could find them on the internet, but this is the kind of study I've been doing for many, many years. This is probably one of the most scholarly set of documents to explain the faiths of man and the religions of man historically, and gives a very, very comprehensive timeline of what our beliefs were at different stages and how we related to life. So going back then to the subject of pornography, which I'm correlating with orgiastic behaviors. Pornography can also be seen as the use of images such as film or erotic photographs to incite emotional response and or excite sexual behavior. But remember, as I said last time, what everyone's so up in their arms about is pornography. If you actually look at what it is and what it is defined as, you are swimming in it in television ads, movies, commercials, and as I said, you can even find pornographic reference and suggestion even in children's movies that are PG rated if you are trained and know exactly what you're looking for, or you're willing to pay attention to what you're watching. So a lot of this really boils down again to programming and belief systems, many of which unfortunately do not evolve, and most of which are highly profitable for the church, for the state, for the medical community, and a variety of other offshoot businesses. For example, look at how many people who have pent up judgmental feelings end up with things like blood sugar handling problems, high blood pressure levels, obesity, and the list of diseases goes long down the road. So if you were to go back and address some of these core issues and help people heal from them, if you could do that on a national level, the cost to the medical system would be so big that it would probably collapse the entire industry of medicine. So my point is, there is a lot of corporate interest in maintaining this, shall we say, confused mindset. If you study PPS Success Mastery Lesson 2, where I show you the science of brainwashing, I show you exactly how ads are constructed, how spiritual documents or scriptures such as the Bible are constructed, and exactly the science that they used in order to control people's behavior and belief systems and get exactly what they wanted out of them, which was largely money, power, land, and control. And if you research it like I have, you'll find that there's documentation showing that the Catholic Church had mastered the science of brainwashing by about the 8th century AD and have been perfecting it ever since. And I highlighted in my first edition, I believe if I remember correctly, that of all the people that I see with cancer of the sex organs, by far the most are people suffering from Catholic programming, and I've had to work through this countless times with people. And remember, I also coach a lot of professional athletes that are dealing with various life crises, and many of these professional athletes are very sexy, beautiful people whose childhood programming runs right into a brick wall when they start having extramarital sex, multiple partner sex, and all these things are as common as white bread amongst professional athletes in general. So they're only mirroring society back to us. So what we're going to do here is have a look. This map, again, shows you going all the way back to 10,000 years before Christ, so 12,015 years ago. And it highlights and gives short summaries of each of the faiths, or shall we say religious beliefs of men in that time period. So the first thing I want to do is look at the fact that trees were the first thing that people worshipped, and back then they didn't really have a God concept. So as I show you the stages of consciousness developing, they were back there in really what would be considered the concrete stage of the development of the mind. So they saw that trees were essentially that which created life. So in other words, the tree was the symbol of God for them, because they concluded that without trees they'd have nothing to eat and they would die. They would not have shelter, which would be a problem. So they noticed that trees were essential to their survival, and therefore the tree became that which was worshipped, which wouldn't be a bad concept to have returned today if you're aware of what's going on in the environment. Next, what you see here is the emergence of the lingam and the yoni, or the sex organs. Again, we went from worshiping trees to worshiping vaginas and penises because people at a childlike level of development in the evolution of psyche actually were able to comprehend that when a penis and a vagina come together, some kind of magic happens out of which life is born. Therefore, if we go all the way back to somewhere around 9000 BC, we see that people were actually worshiping the sex organs, the beauty and the power of the sex organs. And we see, as I will show you, that there is orgiastic behavior if you look at the history of our discoveries on how people related to each other that began all the way back here. And remember, in the first section I told you that we're only 1.8% different than a chimpanzee or a bonobo, our closest biological ancestors, and we are in an animal body. I know that there's a lot of people that have a hard time with that. Anybody that studies physiology, comparative anatomy, and has any real knowledge doesn't play the we're not an animal game. We're a spiritual being in an animal body, and the animal body lives under the regulation of the laws of animal nature and plant nature, and even the nature of the basic forces of the earth, such as the soil, sunlight, water, etc. So if you deny that we carry the animal in us, then you've denied the entire science of genetics, which would suggest to me that one's opinions are really more childlike and emotionally based than adult intelligence, which is common in these topics. So once we get to the lingam and the yoni, we then go to the serpent. The serpent has many meanings. I've got many volumes of books on symbology. I study symbology, and I am an art therapist, so symbology is very important in my work. But as it relates, aside from the physical relationship of the serpent, and there are serpent cults even in Christianity, as I'm sure some of you probably know, but they make the mistake of worshiping the serpent itself as opposed to realizing that the serpent is actually a symbol of how life force energy flows. And if you look at an aerial photo, for example, of any large chunk of land, you will see that there is no such thing as a straight line in nature, and that all creeks, rivers, and waterbeds flow and move just like a big snake, and that life force energy has been known for a long, long time, and to many clairvoyants, to move in that snake-like pattern. And if you look at the science, the current science of the chakra system and what Kundalini is, and even look at the Kataka symbol that's used in medicine, you will see two snakes weaving their way up to the pineal gland, where when they, shall we say, merge together, you have non-dual experiences or unity experiences. So the worship of the serpent really still carries the sex organs in it, and at this level of development, if you study this historical period, one of the reasons that the serpent was worshipped is because it looked like a male penis. A man's penis is, shall we say, snake-like. It's a lot more snake-like than a vagina is. So what you see is, at each step of the way, we never lose any of the remnants of any of these prior religious belief systems. They always somehow make it down and become woven into other religions. But what happens is, the further you get away from the actual source, the more confused and contorted anything gets. For example, if Jesus was alive today, to see what's being said in his name and done in his name, I can assure you he'd have a serious case of heartburn and heartbreak because of the contortion of the message. And remember, he was a guy that apparently, like most masters, did not want people writing things down because he knew what happens when people believe words on paper as opposed to engaging in the experience of becoming that process or person, which is exactly why Osho says there is no such thing as God, only godliness. In other words, talking about God has nothing to do with love and God. It has everything to do with ideas, but to act godly or to act loving and to have empathy and compassion for all human beings and see all the challenges as our challenges and the process of growth into higher consciousness would be godliness. So notice that every one of these colors makes it all the way down to the bottom of the map to where we're at today. So ladies and gentlemen, I hate to tell you this, no matter what your belief or your dogma is, somewhere in your unconscious you carry the wisdom and the experience and the biological urges and the growth and development urges of any creature evolving over time within you. And this is exactly one of the key reasons people today who deny their natural biological history, deny the information contained in their DNA and the evolution of species for which they are the tip of the sword, run into problems like having popes and preachers and all sorts of other stuff having sex with children and doing all sorts of things that they keep hidden, and leads to very, very confusing situations for everybody involved. In other words, repression goes all the way to the top, baby. So what we want to look at here is that the trees, the lingam, the yoni, and the serpent merge together, and here you see that these three together culminate in what's called the worship of fertility, the fertility of a tree. No fertility of the tree, nothing to eat. Nothing for you or the animals. No fertility in the sex organs, and you've got problems, and lo and behold, we've got people all over the world today at a higher rate than ever that cannot get pregnant because they're too unhealthy. So we've lost the magical power of the sex organs, which goes hand in hand with the fact that the number one cause of all disease is stress, and the number one cause of all disease is confusion about what God is and about what love is and about what life is and about what relationships are, believe me. So here we are seeing worship of fecundity. Then we move down and we begin to worship fire. Then we begin to worship the sun. Now, without going through the whole thing, it's just important to remember, again, that each of these stages comes with us. So when we're worshiping fire, we didn't forget about the trees, the sex organs, or the serpent, life force, energy, etc. And then each of these things branches off, and you see different colors going in different directions because different sects include more or less of previous concepts. And this is what it means in spiritual studies or metaphysics or religious studies when they say there is no new religion under the sun. It means all the stuff that you're practicing today can and has been tracked all the way back to the beginning of the period of time for which we actually have any records, fossils, remains, etc. Okay, so that I wanted to point out continues, and during all these periods we were not practicing monogamy, and pornography or orgiastic practices were the way it was done. Tribes could not afford to have monogamous experiences because men could not control their sex urge and their sex energy, and in tribal societies, if women got pregnant more often than once every 3 years, they found that it significantly increased the likelihood that a woman would be seriously injured or die due to the birthing process, and her body would be too over-depleted. And in tribal societies, women were more valuable than men. Men can't give birth. Men can't grow the tribe. Men are not nearly as effective at hunting or at gathering and raising plants. That's even scientifically proven. So we needed to protect the women because they are not only the bringers of life, they are usually significant contributors to the bringing of food and the nurturing and raising of children. So for tribal survival, monogamy did not work, and most tribes didn't practice it. Therefore, you find that a woman could have the child of one man standing there, another child from another man, another child from another man, and children she may not remember which guy was actually the father of, which was a survival tactic because then the children were able to get parental love from almost anybody in the tribe, and since they sometimes, remember, they didn't have DNA testing there, so essentially everyone was everyone's child. All the children were loved and cared for by all members of the tribe and protected by all members of the tribe, and there was intimate bonding between multiple people in the tribe, so they were a much stronger, more cohesive, more spiritually integrated, love-integrated, intuitively responsive unit, which would be more essential for survival in those periods of time due to the distinct difference in living in the wild versus living in a city in a modern world. Now, these orgiastic practices continued, and by the way, research also shows that this period was predominantly matriarchal. Women were in charge. Men were not the rulers and the controllers, and there was no control over land. There was no staking claim to a woman and putting a ring on her finger and calling her yours while going off and having sex with other people's wives and doing all the horse shit that goes on today in the name of repression, suppression, God, or whatever excuse people want to make to justify what is actually their urge to live the way they lived, not only throughout human existence, but as I showed previously, through the entire period of the evolution of species, which includes animals that are lower than chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas, because we carry all that in us. Remember, we have something like 23% of the genes in us that a fruit fly has. We have fruit flies in us. We got bananas in us. We got everything in us. This is why human beings are considered to be the tip of the sword of evolution. We carry all that in us, and when we repress what we really are, we get into a lot of trouble. And when we're guided by wise spiritual leaders, we learn how to manage what comes out of us and put it into context of being healthy and growing to be contributors in society, instead of bumbling idiots on drugs who read books that they can't understand, full of words that they don't know the meanings of, and then claim to be the preachers of God's word, which is understandable when you see the world as a spiritual kindergarten where you have that kind of behavior, which is classic, shall we say, kindergarten behavior. But we often make the assumption that if somebody's wearing an adult body, that they are at the adult level of development, which is dangerously wrong. Now, when we get right here to approximately 2,200 years BC, with the entrance of Zoroaster, or the beginning of the religion of Zoroastrianism, which is also started by the man named Zarathustra, they're the same person, that, according to scholarly evidence, is the beginning of agriculture. Agriculture began somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 years ago, but it has been tied to the teachings of and the practices of Zoroaster or Zarathustra in the Middle East. And interestingly, if you look at the article Cereal Grains, Humanity's Double-Edged Sword by Lauren Cordain, he shows you that the rate of gluten intolerance is significantly lower in the Middle East and gives you the exact historical reference and location where modern agricultural systems had their birthplace. Why this is important is because this is the beginning of the patriarchal system of control. This is where it was with the beginning of agriculture that we begin to mark off plots of land and to lay stake to them and protect them for with whatever method it took, from bloodshed to war to torture, you name it. This is when women became objects of men's control. This is when men, shall we say, turned a woman into a prized possession that nobody else could touch, and led to the diminishing of women's rights and the diminishing of respect for women's contributions to life, to family, to education, and to evolution, and led to what ultimately led to what we know of as women's lib, as a sort of a knee-jerk or healing reaction to patriarchal control, which goes right back to the religion of Zarathustra or Zoroastrianism and the beginning of agriculture. And there's a wide variety of books that's well discussed in Sex at Dawn. There's a number of other books that go into this, and I can't give you all the books because it would take me half an hour just to go through them all. Then we go all the way down and we start seeing all of this control issues coming down, and we get all the way down to Christianity at the bottom. You know, Christians are down here. This is early Christianity, Old Testament type stuff. So around the year 300 BC, if I got my map right here. But anyhow, you got the pre-Christian era, or you got the Old Testament era, then you got the New Testament era, and then it just continues into what we're dealing with today. So in summary then, orgiastic practices were part of our faith and were demonstrations of our beliefs and how nature functioned and our expressions of ourselves as parts of nature, and our practices sexually were very, very similar to our nearest biological relatives and many, many other species that have been categorized as monogamous and using a pair bonding model, but careful scrutiny of the research shows that it is religious imprinting by scientists trying to make things fit their paradigm, which is typical. Okay? So now what we're going to do before I finish is I'm going to take you through the orgiastic practices through the ages. There's too much to put on the board here. I had my assistant Vidya compile a document from scholarly references and some of the books in my library and things that carry this information, so I could just show you that this is going on for a long time. This is nothing new, and it's very much a part of who we are, and it's a lot of the way we behave today, especially the Islamic Judeo-Christian groups, are, shall we say, in deep denial of their own history. And again, that's repression, and wherever you repress, you compress, and things eventually explode and come out sideways and may come out in other ways. So if we go back, so now I'm looking at culture and time, very similar to this, but now I'm going to reference cultures over periods of time. 24,000 BCE, Egypt, the oldest dildo ever found. So all the way back 24,000 years ago, based on scientific dating systems, we have people playing with dildos. So there you go. That's a bit of a history for you. From 12,000 to 3,000 BCE, that's before Christ's entry, if you will, we had Paleolithic and Mesolithic cave paintings and carvings depicted. Sexually, humans with humans, humans with animals, vulvas, penises. Exaggerated sexual characteristics were normal. Zoophilia and bestiality appeared in rock art around the onset of the Neolithic domestication of animals. That remained common through the classical period into the Middle Ages and was integrated into myths and legends. So you see it, many myths. All you got to do is study basic mythology and you see all sorts of this type of stuff. 5200 BCE, Europe, Germany, sculpture of a man and a woman having sex. Then we go to the period of 3500 to 1000 BCE. Mediterranean cultures celebrated phallophoric ceremonies, considered generative of life and seats. So phallophoric means dick focused. Greece and Rome, mocking jovial public displays of phalli included singing satirical and obscene songs, joking, and later celebrated in sacred orgies, masturbating themselves, so that people would later masturbate themselves in these sacred orgies. The phallus is an object of worship and a symbol of fertility, and various types of dildos were used in these ceremonies. Sex was often ritualized with a public display. Well, what's the difference between sex on television and this? I mean, a lot of people are running a really seriously damaging double standard. Half the people that are got all this anti-pornography stuff, you can watch them walking right out of rated R and X movies and all this stuff. So again, this is largely childish behavior and confused behavior. And here's an interesting and shocking one for some of you. Pedestry was normal and encouraged. Adult males and male youths were entering into erotic love affairs. That was a principal way of educating the youth and passing on many skills or manly skills. And again, we're talking about 3500 to 1000 BCE. So sex with children was normal and seen as a way of educating them. So imagine now, here's a chance for you to think about, if you believe in reincarnation, I'm not saying you need to, but I'm saying if you do believe in reincarnation, you've got to remember that there's quite a long time lag in many instances between the death of a soul and the rebirth of the soul. So people coming from these past generations are coming into a new life, and if you study spiritual science, you'll find that the soul carries all the urges and desires and experiences within it into each lifetime. This is one of the explanations, for example, of how you get geniuses like Mozart, that all of a sudden show up and by 4 years of age are performing at extremely high levels, by 10 years blowing everybody away, which doesn't make sense from a one lifetime perspective. Otherwise, there would be a lot of geniuses everywhere doing that, because that would be more the norm. So what I'm saying is, when you look at the history of human life and the history of human psychological and social development and sexual development, and the radical difference between different eras of our own time, and not too far away either, a soul could easily be reborn into the world with urges that are now considered serious taboos, largely by undeveloped, confused people, as I will show you. So we can continue on here. You know, I've got pages of this stuff, so I'm just going to say enough to make the point. 570 BEC, before Christ's entry, Sappho's hymn to Aphrodite suggests homoerotic lesbianism. Orgies were an integral and very important part of Greek life. The Eleusinian Mysteries, a 9-day annual ritual, took place, which first documented major orgies of a civilized society. The Dionysian ritual and ceremony dated back to the classical 5th century BCE. Rites of initiation which use intoxicants and other trance-inducing techniques also provided liberation for those marginalized by Greek society, women, slaves, and foreigners. Etruscans used orgies as entertainment. It was common for wife sharing. Rome, worship of Bacchus. Festivals when wine followed. Both men and women enjoyed each other without censor by suspending everyday rules, and all sexual prohibitions were suspended. Romans considered depictions of sex in decoration to be in good taste. Large phalli or penises were often used near entryways as a good luck charm. Carvings were common in homes. Bisexuality and anal sex was acceptable. Bestiality was the center of attraction at the Colosseum and in Circus Magnus, so that wasn't that long ago. Romans engaged and documented their use of orgies. Cults of Cybele, Isis, Bona Dea, all involved orgiastic rites. So I could go through this all the way up till recently, and as you can see, I've got many things underlined to make the points over and over again. So here we go all the way up. Then we get to medieval Europe. Once we reach medieval Europe, erotic scenes in medieval illuminated manuscripts also appeared mostly in the margins of books. After the fall of the Roman and the rise of Christianity, orgies became shunned by the civilized world. Its only documented presence was during the English Restoration of the 1660s. So you see right there, when Christianity starts sinking its little hooks into you and becoming a profitable means of controlling people, you have to begin to deny your entire biological evolution and your spiritual or religious evolution or evolution of the faiths in man. I'd say that's a hell of a lot of history to have to repress. That would be like repressing, saying, I'm going to repress the animal in me, which means you now have no autonomic nervous system and you're essentially dead. Okay, so now I want to turn to a fantastic book, Chaos, Creativity, and Cosmic Consciousness by Rupert Sheldrake, Terence McKenna, and Ralph Abram. 3 geniuses, by the way. And we want to see what Terence McKenna, who was a world-famous ethnobotanist, who probably had about 5 degrees at PhDs and was a very, very intelligent man who was very open to exploring these things both scientifically and personally. And he has some interesting comments that relate directly to what we just talked about. Page 46. Psychoactive compounds that were brought into the expanding human diet during the early part of our evolution inhibited the formation of the ego, promoting instead collectivist, tribal partnership values, operating intuitively in a reciprocal feedback relationship with the feminine vegetable matrix of the biosphere. In other words, nothing was verbalized, everything was felt, everything was intuited. Regularly, at new and full moons, small groups of hunter-gatherer and pastoralists took hallucinogenic plants and dissolved their boundaries, engaging in group sex and annealing irregularities that had cropped up in their personal self-imagining since the last session. In other words, they used them to heal themselves and get over their illusions. These practices kept cultural regularly grounded on the plane of group and species values, which was in dynamic balance with the ecosystem. When these practices were disrupted as supplies of these plants diminished, new religious forms arose, and the time between these great festivals grew longer and longer. The ego began to take hold, first as a kind of cancerous aberration, and quickly becoming a new style of behavior that eliminated other styles of behavior by suppressing access to the source of chaos. Chaos, in this context, is the Greek term for silence, or the gap between vibrations, or the gap between events. So chaos is really a word that describes going into the nothingness, or the void out of which everything emerges. So it's not chaos like out of order. It's something much deeper than that. It means going into the dark of yourself and exploring what you really are instead of running from it, which is what shamanic journeying and vision quests are about. The point I want to make is that between the ego and the full understanding of reality is a barrier. The fear of the ego to surrender to the fact of chaos. In other words, the ego is a control monster, and it has a really hard time with thinking it doesn't understand what's about to happen, or walking in the dark. If it can't control, it becomes fearful and often reacts violently. In a pre-modern society, no woman could escape chaos because the automatic birth script that had women giving birth over and over until death. Women are biologically scripted into being much closer to chaos simply because there are certain episodes in the life of a female that are guaranteed to become boundary dissolving. For example, when a woman gives birth, gets pregnant, her boundaries dissolve. A woman may have once been a very sexy, beautiful thing, and now she's got this great big belly, a swollen ass, boobs out of proportion, looks in the mirror, and her boundaries are being dissolved. Then she gives birth and she has a chance to transform her body back again. Then there's the events of children, often died early, so a part of herself died. So what he's saying here is that women are much more ideally suited to engaging with chaos than men are, which is one of the reasons men suppress them, because they're, shall we say, hard for men to handle for a variety of reasons. Often because they're smarter than men and they work harder than men. Hate to say it, guys. The psychology of feminine sexuality, which involves the acceptance of penetration, creates an entirely different relationship to boundary than does the male need to fulfill the potential to penetrate. So there's a big difference. We have lost touch with chaos because it is feared by the dominant archetype of the world ego. The ego's existence is defined in terms of control. The endless modeling processes that the ego carries out is an effort to fight the absence of closure. The ego wants closure. It wants a complete explanation. So I could go on for hours on the ego, but you can see that what he's showing you here is that we were regularly using psychedelic substances that are everywhere in nature, in any country, to create a dissolving experience of the ego in which we lost shoulda, woulda, coulda, didn't, and we merged each other with each other in sexual union. And as you can see from what I just read, it could have been men on men, women on women, and even children involved, but they said that they weren't worried about the children because they did not have, a child does not have, a male boy can't give birth, so and produce birth because he doesn't have active sperm in him yet. He's not able to produce sperm until he's ready to do that, and a woman that's not ovulating can't get pregnant. So they saw that the kids were going through what was called role play, lo and behold, learning how to be an adult. Now, if you study sex in different cultures, you see that this was very common to let kids have this. Osho talks all about this, by the way, and talks about how screwed up Americans are because of all the repression that doesn't exist in India. And so there's some very, very important processes here. And if you read the book Voices of the First Day by Robert Lawler, that outlines the Aboriginal cultures life and everything about them, including their sexual practices, you see the Aboriginals had a very highly evolved system for teaching children sexuality, which included sexual play right from the very beginning, and even encouraging them to go out and see if they could find adults having sex and then come report about it at the campfire so everybody could laugh and have fun. And so sex was also much more fun for them, and they encouraged males to have sex with multiple females, and they were matriarchal. The women would not let them get married until all the women in the tribe deemed a young man capable of pleasuring a woman and being worth getting married to. So look at what we got going on today. Think of all the complaints women have about men sexually, and imagine if you were trained in an Aboriginal culture, there would be a lot more happy women around, and there would be a lot less people watching pornography on television, because they would be wondering, why would you want to watch that? Let's just get in bed and enjoy it. Okay? So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause right here before I go into the next section, because I'm pressed for time, and that's a lot to digest. In the next part then, and what I'll make part 3, I'll give you a quick overview. We will look at the now scientifically validated stages of the development of the human consciousness, or the human psyche, if you will, and I will show you how each stage of development correlates to the religious ideas of the world and the religious practices of the world. And down here I correlate each of the different levels of psychological development and religious practice to their beliefs in pornography. And then when you have this in your head and you understand what's going on and what science has uncovered, you can then look at each person's views on pornography or sex in general, or a variety of things, and it's very, very easy to determine where they're at in their psychological development. And just so you know, I've been studying this stuff for a long, long time. So when people write comments to me on my website about these topics, I can tell in about 3.5 nanoseconds who I'm dealing with. And typically you'll find a lot of these nasty, offhanded, snot-nosed comments are coming from people at the very lowest levels of development, which unfortunately makes up the largest percentage of the world population today, which is what we would expect in a kindergarten for souls. I'll look forward to sharing the stages of consciousness and how it develops as it relates to the issue of pornography and other things in part 3 of this most exciting and interesting series. I hope you're having fun. Thanks for joining me. I'm Paul Chek.